Thank you very much, Mattia. And if you have questions, general questions about the ACES project, please post them in the Q&A and we can bring them up again in the wrap-up session. So just a brief introduction. Our next speaker has a very prolific PhD student at DTU Electro, and she has already produced a bunch of high-quality publications during the ACES project. So to tell us about the charging needs for 1 million EVs, please welcome Lisa Calearo.
Thank you, Peter. Yes, I'm Lisa Calearo, a PhD student here at DTU, and I will present you the charging needs for 1 million electric vehicles. So first of all, 1 million electric vehicles represent approximately 40% of all the vehicles in Denmark. So even though this analysis is based on these 1 million electric vehicles, that is a scenario that has been studied for the 2030 in Denmark, the results that we are going to present could also be applied to other nations or other kind of studies. But first of all, I'm going to give you an overview of what I'm going to present. So I will give you an overview of the charging profiles derivation, which are connected then with the coincidence factor and the distribution grid impact. Why I'm going to give you this derivation of the charging profiles? Since there are not enough electric vehicles in Denmark, but of course we know that all over the world, we cannot use like the electric vehicles that there are right now as simple, like to know the charging profiles. So we need to derive the charging profile for large EV penetrations. So we are going to do that first of all, and we are considering mostly the home charging, as the home charging is the charging power that is preferred today from the majority of the population. And then since in the like in the future, we will also start to consider more fast and public chargers, we are also doing an analysis to see how many fast and public chargers we will need in Denmark for succeed these 1 million electric vehicles in 2030. So first of all, how do we derive the charging profile of a large population of electric vehicles? We need to know different characteristics. So we need to know the characteristic of the electric vehicle and the battery, but for example, the battery capacity, but then we need also to know the charger characteristics. So the charging power, the property, and so on, because the charging power can be 3.7 kilowatts or 50 kilowatts. So our vehicle can charge very fast or very slow. And then we need also to know the electric vehicle users characteristics. So how many how many kilometers per day the user is driving, the departure and arrival time, and then also the charging probability. So for understanding and deriving this charging profile for the population in Denmark, we have been selecting some characteristics of the user characteristics and these kind of characteristics for the Danish population. So first of all, we are going to see the main characteristics that we need to derive the charging profiles. So we have the average distance driven in, we need the average distance driven in from the population. So we need to know how the population is driving. So as you may see here, we have that there are different groups of the population depending on the kilometers driven per day. So we have, for example, group 1, which is approximately 11% of the population of the cars, that drives between 0 and 10 kilometers per day. And then there are the different groups, but what you can see is that the average distance driven in Denmark is 45 kilometers per day. Then this is telling us how many kilometers, and then this is related then with the energy needs for our car. But then we need to know also if our user is charging every day or not. Because, for example, a user that drives only 4 or 5 kilometers per day, maybe it doesn't need to charge every day. So what we needed to know is, okay, are the electric vehicles, like the users of the electric vehicles, charging every day? And since we don't have enough electric vehicles in Denmark, we need to consider this charging probability. We consider this charging probability from 10,000 electric vehicles derived from a Japanese study. And this curve is showing us how the plug-in probability, so the rate, plug-in rate at home, is changing depending on the state of charge and the distance driven per day. As you may see, for example, for group 1, if we have one vehicle in group 1, which is driving from 0 to 10 kilometers per day, if at the beginning of the day it has a 1% or 100% of state of charge, or 1 per unit state of charge, after the one day it has been driving 0 to 10 kilometers, so the state of charge goes down, but it will not go down a lot, so the plug-in rate at home is still very low. But you can see that lower is the state of charge, higher is the plug-in rate, and instead also higher is the distance driven per day, higher will be the plug-in probability. So now we know the distance driven per day and the probability of plugging in. We need also to consider the charging time. So first of all, when are we starting to charge our vehicle? And for deriving that, since we are considering mostly of charging, which is the most used charging nowadays, we need to consider the frequency of the arrival at home of our users of the vehicles of the population. And in this figure, you can see the frequency of the population for arriving at home. And as you may see, the majority of the population is arriving at home between 4 and 7 in the evening. And this does make sense because when we know that the work time in Denmark is from 7, 8 in the morning to 4, 5 in the afternoon, we know that the majority of the population will arrive at home during this amount of time. But this will be for us the plug-in charging time. But then we need also to consider how long our vehicle needs to charge. So we have been considering 2 different charging power. The single phase charging power, which is 3.7 kilowatts, and the free phase charging power, 11 kilowatts, which is possible in Denmark as a lot of houses have a free phase connection. So then we consider a 40 kilowatt hour Nielsen leaf for this first analysis. And then we could evaluate the accumulated, based on the accumulated kilometer and the charging power, we could evaluate the charging time. As you can see, for example, a vehicle that is driving 45 kilometers per day, so the average Danish driving distance per day, would need to charge approximately 3 hours when we have single phase chargers, and 1 hour instead when we have free phase chargers. So based on all these characteristics, we could derive a model which is creating charging profiles for our population. So in the first analysis, we have been considering a conservative scenario where the plug-in time is distributed between 4 and 7 in the evening. So we have not been considering all the curve we have seen before, but only for 4 to 7. So 25 start at 4, 25 at 5, and so on. And here you may see 2 electric vehicles from 2 different groups. The first electric vehicle is from group 1, so it is driving from 0 to 10 kilometers per day. And as you may see, the vehicle that is driving not so many kilometers per day, it does need to charge only the first day over the entire week. And then depending if it's charging with a single or free phase chargers, the charging power and the charging time is different. Indeed, with single phase chargers, we have only 3.7 kilowatts, but the charging time is 3 times the time that we would need with the free phase chargers. Differently, instead, we see here a vehicle that drives more kilometers per day would need to charge more often. This is a case where the vehicle was charging every day, but it is not for sure necessary like that, but anyway, it's charging more often. When then we use our model to simulate many electric vehicles, we can derive the aggregated charging power of many electric vehicles. In this case, we will consider 127 households, which is a representative figure in Denmark, but 127, this number you will understand later on why we have been considering this number specifically, but just consider that we have 127 households with 100% of EV penetration, meaning 127 vehicles. If we consider then 1 day of charging power, you could see of the vehicles charging, you can see that throughout 1 day, we have that the share of electric vehicles charging, or also called coincidence factor, is not reaching more than 40% when we charge with single-phase chargers, and it's not reaching more than 22% when we charge with three-phase chargers. But as you can see, even though we have less electric vehicles charging simultaneously with three-phase chargers, the charging time is actually lower, so they need less time to charge. And then instead with single-phase charger, we need more time to charge. But the important thing is that this number is telling only the amount of electric vehicles that are charging together. We have also to go then and check the active power consumption, which is the aggregated active power of all our vehicles. So if we check the aggregated active power, we can see here that even though there are less electric vehicles charging simultaneously with three-phase chargers, the active power consumption is much higher. Indeed, we reach approximately 300 kilowatt with three-phase chargers. Instead, we have less than 200 kilowatt with single-phase chargers. But as you may see, the three-phase chargers is finished to charge much before than the single-phase chargers, because a single-phase charger requires more time as there is less power. So this was the case with 127 vehicles. Then we know that in the, okay, this is 100% of penetration, but we know that to reach 100% of penetration, we will have like an increase of electric vehicles. So to understand how many, with different amount of electric vehicles, how the coincidence factor is growing, or is growing, we went from 5 to 100 electric vehicles. In this analysis, we consider that electric vehicles are distributed over the entire day, as we saw the curve of the arrival time of before. So we didn't consider only 4, 5, 7, 6, and 7. But what we did in this analysis was to increase the amount of electric vehicles and check the coincidence factor, like derive the coincidence factor. And what we can see here is that changing the battery capacity from 24 kilowatt hour to 60 kilowatt hour and keeping the charging power always equal to 11 kilowatt, the coincidence factor is always approximately 22%. So there is not, like, the coincidence factor is not changing if we increase the amount of, the capacity of our battery. This is interesting, but it's also like, it makes sense, because if you think about it, we have a bigger battery, but at the end, the distance driven per day of the population is not changing. Like, the energy needs from the population is always the same. It's only that, for example, if a person has a 24 kilowatt hour battery, and with a 24 kilowatt hour battery, he needs to charge twice per week. Maybe with a 60 kilowatt hour, he just needs to charge once per week. But at the end, the coincidence factor is not very impacted from this factor. What we did then instead was to keep the battery capacity the same, so 24 kilowatt hour battery capacity, and change the charging power. Change the charging power from 3.7 kilowatt to 11 kilowatt, as we did also before, and then to 22 kilowatt. So as you may see, and as we also saw in the previous case with 127 vehicles, when we increase the charging power, the coincidence factor is actually decreasing. But pay attention that this does not tell us that the charging power, the aggregated charging power, is actually lower, because as we saw before, the charging power, peak charging power consumption with 11 kilowatt was actually higher. So this is the amount of electric vehicles that are charging together. But now we are also interested on seeing what is the impact on the distribution grid of these vehicles charging together. So what we did was to take the island of Bornholm. Bornholm is a Danish island connected to Sweden. And we decided to use this distribution grid present, that is called present in time. And this distribution grid has the transformer, 400 kilowatt transformer, kilowatt ampere transformer. Then we have 4 main feeders connected with these 4 cables. And here there are the 127 households. And this is the reason why before we were choosing this number, 127 households. It's important also to notice that we have been considering 1 winter week of our analysis, and this is actually a very conservative scenario because this winter week was a very cold week, and in this distribution grid, it is common to have electric heating. So, how did we do this analysis? First of all, we analyze the case without electric vehicles. So the base case scenario for us is the case without electric vehicles. Then we went to the case with single phase chargers. So we included from 25 to 100% of penetration with uncontrolled charging, so the one that we saw before. And we distributed our single phase chargers throughout the entire grid. We tried to distribute them equally between the three phases, so 33% of EVs per phase. Then we also considered a case with 100% of electric vehicle penetration, three-phase chargers, and in this case, yes, they were distributed on all the households, as we have 100% of penetration. The analysis that I'm going to present now is mostly based on transformer and cable loading and voltage analysis of the most critical terminals. So, first of all, the base case scenario. The base case scenario was like the analysis of this winter week, and from this we could find out which was the most loaded cable, which is this one in this distributed grid, and then which was also the terminal with the lowest voltages. And we found out that was this terminal at the end of the feeder. But we saw that there were not overloading periods, and there were not problems with under voltage at the different terminals. So what we did then was to include also the electric vehicles. So here the first analysis is based on single phase chargers. You can see here on the left the transformer the apparent power at the transformer level. With the black line, you may see the apparent power at the transformer without electric vehicles. So as the scenario is right now. And as you may see, already around 6, 7 in the evening, we have an increase of the consumption because, of course, the population, like people arrive at home, they start to cook and so on. Then we started increasing, including the electric vehicles with single phase. So 25%, 50%, 75%, and 100%. And what was very positive is that we didn't observe any overloading of the transformer, since, as you may see here, the 400 kilovolt ampere is never reached. Similar case was with the cables. But, yeah, and I'm not presenting here the cables since it was very similar. But what we could see instead was that at the terminals, with the increase of the electric vehicle penetration, the three phases were more like they were getting unbalanced. As you may see, indeed, it is here that with 100% of penetration, we have phase A that is much more loaded than the other two phases. You can see that already at the beginning, one phase was more loaded, like phase A was more loaded than the other two phases, because already our households are like distributed, they are not perfectly distributed as 33% and 33% between the three phases. But when we increase the amount of electric vehicles and we have this very large penetration of the EVs, the imbalances could create problems with under voltage at the different terminals. So this was the case with single phase chargers. What was happening instead what would happen instead if we have 100% of EV penetration but with three phase chargers? So here in the first, I'm comparing the single phase chargers 100% of penetration with the three phase chargers 100% of penetration. As you may see, when we have three phase chargers instead of single phase chargers, we do not observe any under voltage issues. Indeed, the three phases are much more balanced. The problem instead is with the loading of the transformers and the cables, because as you may see here that we are comparing the transformer loading with single phase and three phase chargers. we have that the mean value is more or less the same, so 40%, but the maximum value with the free phase chargers is 120. So the 100% of maximum value of the loading of the transformer is reached for 9 hours, more than 9 hours throughout the entire week, meaning more than 1 hour per day, more or less. And then also we observed that also some cables were getting overloaded, and this is a case with the cable that we showed before, where we have more than 2 hours of overloading. So what can we say about this scenario? So we have been studying this low voltage grid with approximately 100 cars, and if we consider 100% of penetration, we have a coincidence factor that should be maximum 40% with 3.7 kilowatt. Which are the consequences of these large EV penetrations in our distribution grid? We could have, with single phase chargers, we would observe mostly imbalances between the different phases. Instead, when we have free phase chargers, we would observe more problems closer to the overloading of our transformer and cables. What can we say then about the entire Denmark? So about the idea of having 1 million electric vehicles in 2030. 1 million electric vehicles, as we said before, is approximately 40% of the 2.5 million cars that there are today in Denmark. But we can say that an average distribution grid would be able to handle approximately 50% of electric vehicles without criticality, but we have to pay attention that the margins would be reduced. The margins of our cables, loading, and components would be reduced. It's also important to consider other two things that we have not been considering in this analysis, because we have been considering the natural charging behavior, and the natural charging behavior does not consider synchronization effects, like, for example, time of use tariff, CO2 prices, and so on. But we said then that if we have 100 electric vehicles without synchronization, we would have approximately 40% of vehicles charging together, which with 3.7 kilowatt would be approximately 150 kilowatt. But if we consider a synchronization effect, we could also get to have all electric vehicles charging together. And these would create like a large peak of 307 kilowatt, which is more than the double than what we have with natural charging. And then we have not been considering the public charges and workplace charging, as it is as the home charging is the most used nowadays. But to understand what is the impact of public charges and workplace charging, we need to consider also how many of these we would have. So we have also been doing an analysis regarding that. So we want to understand how many public chargers we will need if we want 1 million electric vehicles in Denmark in 2030. For doing so, we need to consider two different charging needs. So there is the everyday charging and the long distance charging. So just starting with the second one, which is actually the simpler one. For example, if we want to go from Copenhagen to Germany or from Copenhagen to Aalborg, we can see that, okay, we need with electric vehicles capacities, like electric vehicles that we have now, we need more, most likely to have some charging points for long distance charging, which to understand how many charging points we will need, we need to focus more on a country basis analysis. But then this is not the only one, because we have also the everyday charging. As you may know, there are big cities like Copenhagen where the majority of the population is living in apartments, and not the majority of population maybe does not have access to a single their own private garage or public parking space. Instead, when we live in smaller cities or outside in the countryside, the majority of the population has access to their own private parking space. So we need to consider how large population would need access to would have access to home charging, and how much does not have access to home charging. And for doing so, we need to focus on the municipalities. So For understanding this, we have been doing an analysis based on the average battery capacity of 80 kilowatt-hour and the minimum charging power of 22 kilowatt and a maximum charging power of 250 kilowatt. As we said before, 1 million electric vehicles in Denmark is 40% of all the cars in all Denmark. And in this analysis, we consider that it would represent also 40% of all the cars in all the municipalities. So what we did was to take each municipality in Denmark, and here I'm just showing two of the municipalities, Copenhagen and Lingby, and then we needed to collect some data. So we have that Copenhagen and Copenhagen is okay. Copenhagen, everyone knows about Copenhagen. Instead, Lingby is a smaller municipality that is 20 minutes north of Copenhagen, but is actually very close to Copenhagen. But we can see that the characteristics of the two municipalities are actually different, because we can see that in Copenhagen we have approximately 1 vehicle every 2 households. Instead, in Lingby, we have 1 vehicle per household. Then we have the kilometer driven per vehicle per day. Then we have the percentage of individual parking on private property, percentage of collective parking at property, the percentage of public curbside parking. And as you can see, Copenhagen has a large percentage of these. Instead, Lingby, which have mostly houses and not so many apartments like there are in Copenhagen, the percentage of public curbside is larger. And then we have the number of the electric vehicles, which is the 40% of all the cars in the municipalities, both for Copenhagen and Lingby.
Lisa, so, we need to wrap up for questions.
Yes. So then we can derive the amount of charging stations from each municipality. We can derive the driving distance per day, the energy need to charge the vehicle. And then from the energy need to charge the vehicle, we will have the home charging and the public charging. And at the end, we can derive the number of charging stations. Here you may see how many charging stations we would need in the entire Denmark, so 27,000, which would correspond to a large investment of approximately 450 million euro. So what can we conclude? We said that there are not enough electric vehicles today to derive charging patterns. So we can derive the charging patterns depending on the different main influence factors, such as distance driven per day, charging probability, and arrival departure time. Then we said that with the coincidence factor of large EV penetration, we would not have more than 40 electric vehicles charging together if we consider a 3.7 kilowatt and the natural charging. And then the coincidence factor would highly depend on the charging power, but not on the battery size. Then we said single phase chargers is mostly close to, would mostly cause voltage imbalances with large EV penetration. Instead, three phase chargers would mostly cause overloading of the components. And at the end, we said that 1 million electric vehicles would require like many public chargers, approximately 27,000, and a large investment. And pay attention that these 3.4 billion coronas investment would not count for the public chargers, which are not present yet in the in the power system. So this was all. Here there are some references, and thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for your very nice presentation. So we'll just take a few questions. Right now, among the open questions, the most popular is from ACES, who asks us to elaborate a little bit more on the battery size and how it relates to the coincidence factor, and whether big battery size would actually reduce the coincidence factor.
So as I was showing here before, the idea is that larger batteries, like if you go I'm not speaking about 200 kilowatt hour batteries, but if we go from a range of 24 to 60, 80 kilowatt hour batteries, these would not change so much the coincidence factor, because at the end, the energy needs that the population has could be more or less the same. So as I said before, like if I have a 24 kilowatt hour battery and I drive 10 kilometers per day, I would need maybe to charge every 3 days. Instead, if I have a 60 kilowatt hour battery, I will need to charge maybe once every 6 days. But at the end, the energy needs would be more or less the same. So since if we consider a large amount of electric vehicles, the coincidence factor is not expecting to be very like, it's not expecting to change so much. It's more dependent on the charging power. If that's
right. Thank you very much, Lisa. I'll take one question actually from the answered session, just because I like it's a bit provocative. This is from Xavier. So should the DSO actually go out and promote higher charging power? You also touched upon this previously. Should we say as much power as possible?
I would say no, but I mean, it is a balance. I would say that different charging power, a good combination of all the charging powers would be the best. But also because in like larger charging power would also have bad influences with the battery degradation, which my colleague Matteo will speak more about afterwards. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say no, not larger charging power. I think a lower charging power, like 3.7 kilowatt, would, from the point of view of the distribution system, it's simpler to, yeah, to check, like to keep the distribution grid under control.
Yes, and I think a very brief last question, the most liked question right now from with one like from Eura. How would charging patterns profiles change if consumers would know that they would use the EVs for providing grid services and could make money from it? So again, I think it's this topic of when you have a conditioned or controlled charging scenario.
Yeah. So as we say, this is a bit difficult to answer because we have been doing some analysis, but we don't know how many people would accept to use their vehicle for providing, for example, frequency regulation or so on. So it is still a question, and we are still looking into this question. But we would say that if there are like very provocative way for like making the population make money throughout the grid services and so on, it could be that a larger population would charge at the same time due to this. So this could actually, like this way of this profitability could also create some more problems on the power system, I would say. But then it depends also which kind of which kind of system is used, time of use tariff, CO2 prices, frequency regulation. They are quite different. So I think always a combination of them is like the best way.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa, for considering time. We need to jump on to the next presentation. I will archive these questions so we can consider them later, the questions we haven't been able to answer in this session.
Yes, of course.
Thank you.